In this lesson, we will talk about how you can calculate how much time you need for a transition so that it's not too fast or too slow. Okay, so I'm starting off here in 10_begin in the After Effects project files. And what I'm going to be doing in here is just animating my null that's controlling my camera. So sometimes when you're first starting off animating, you kind of start to change the way that you're animating your keyframes based on really just what looks good as a distance between keyframes on your timeline. So I'll go ahead and set a few keyframes like this. I'm just going to go ahead and set one right here at the beginning, then move forward just a little bit in time here, and then zoom towards my next subject here. We'll just kind of reposition that null. So now we have an animation that looks like that. So we go from one person to the other. Now, depending on how long you normally work with on your timeline, this is maybe an okay approach to use. If you always make videos that are 1 minute long, spaces between your keyframes are going to start to represent a certain amount of time to you. But then what happens if you're working with a much shorter or much longer composition? You're going to use that same visual distance between your keyframes, and it's going to give you either a way too fast or a way too slow kind of animation. So let's just watch through this little animation that we've created. I'm just going to hit that 0 key on my number pad to create a RAM preview. And obviously this is way too fast. Even if I turn on motion blur for these layers, you see that it only gives us really 1 frame for us to see this main person here. And then really just a few frames for us to get from him to our last person. So that's because we're working with a really short composition. So this is only about 3.5 seconds long. So I want to talk about how you can calculate how many frames you need to be able to create a transition like this. Now the value I'm going to give you is pretty variable, and it really depends on what you're creating. But it has a lot to do with the frame rate that you're using in your composition. So I want to go ahead and check that for this composition just so you know what we're basing this on. So to check the frame rate that you have set up for your composition, we'll just come up here to Composition, Composition Settings, and we see right there we have our frame rate set up to 24 frames per second. Okay, so we'll keep that number in mind. Now, anytime I want to create a transition that is something moving, maybe something's moving onto my screen from off screen, or I'm moving my camera, I almost never want it to be less than half of my frame rate. So what does that mean? The amount of frames that my transition is going to take would be 24 frames if I was going to take 1 second to create that transition. So if I just scrub out here to a full 1 second, that's going to be 24 frames from this beginning part here to the ending part. So right at the beginning of our composition is 0, and then right here at 1 second is 24 frames. And you can see that if we look over here at the time, I've got 1 second on the time and then 24 frames right below it. So this is just a pretty good indicator of what 1 second looks like. It's almost a third of our entire timeline simply because we're working with such a short amount of time. So I never like for my transitions to last for any duration shorter than half of 1 second. So based on whatever your frame rate is, if you're working at 15 frames per second, you probably wouldn't want your transitions to last any distance or any duration shorter than 7.5 seconds. So I'm going to grab this keyframe and drag that right to the middle between my current time indicator that's sitting at 24 frames and my first keyframe that's sitting at the very first frame there, so sitting at 0. And you'll notice that this still feels pretty fast, but it's better. So this is really the minimum amount of time that I would allow for a transition like this. And one thing that would help it even though it would give it a little bit more distance, is just dragging that null backwards a little bit more towards us, so we see our subject a little bit longer here in the foreground. Or maybe adding a pause to this would help as well. So even just dragging those keyframes forward a little bit, that is going to make that transition feel a little bit more natural. So you can see this is really a minimum for this big of a shot to move from this person to this person. 12 frames still feels like not quite enough. Now, let's say we were just going to animate this person in from the side over here. I'm just going to start out with him right there, and I'll bring up this position so that we can animate that, and we'll go ahead and set a keyframe right there at the beginning, and then we'll move forward to set our next keyframe. Now there's a specific way that I can count how many frames I want to move forward with keyboard shortcuts instead of looking over here and trying to drag this to the perfect frame rate right there. So instead of trying to drag that and get it right on the 12 so that that's half my frame rate, I can do something different. I can hold down the shift key and hit the page down key. Now that's going to move me forward 10 frames at a time. So if I want to just move forward single frames or backwards single frames, I can use the page up and page down keys without the shift key. So I'll move forward 2 more frames by hitting the page down key twice. And you see that brought us a little bit closer to our subject there in the background. And now I'm ready to go ahead and animate in my person over here from the side. I'm just going to turn off my camera options so that I'm not using those keyframes so I can still see this person. And we'll just move him over just kind of right there to the middle. So I'll do a quick frame preview so you can see what this looks like. And I'm just going to preview to that spot right there. So this looks like a pretty reasonable timing for this transition. It might feel a little bit fast, but it doesn't feel so fast that we feel like there's been a mistake or that something is missing. Now you can always add more time, and usually if I add something like maybe just a whole second for a transition like this, that usually gives me even more desirable results, and there's no chance of that usually being too quick. But definitely the minimum would be half the amount of frames that my frame rate is set to. So anytime you just say, oh, I want this to take 1 second, it could change based on what your frame rate is. So let's go ahead and create an animation with the null object that we had before and have that happen over 1 second. I'll go ahead and turn back on the eyes for that. And you can see that this is even a little bit more desirable than what we had earlier. It doesn't feel like anything's really popping on and off. And again, if I just scoot those forward a little bit so that we have a little bit of a pause at the beginning, that looks a lot more natural. So in this lesson, we learned that as a general and flexible rule, you should use no less than half the frames of your frame rate to create a transition.